Hello and welcome to the Leading Lounge. I'm your host, Dr. Justin Dubose. Here in the Leading Lounge, we talk with today's leaders and unpack lessons learned and being learned from a career of leading and communicating in their field. These conversations are designed to be both informal and informative, and we want to equip you with wisdom and tools to empower you as a leader where you are and where you want to be. All right, everybody, if you've ever wanted to hear and learn from the very best of the best, then today is for you. I approached my company first sergeant in my Army Reserve unit, Carlos Delavilla, and asked him if he would be willing to sit down with me to close out this season, this first season of the Leading Lounge. And he said, sure, I'd be happy to. And so without telling you too much of his story, Carlos graduated from high school, immediately joined the Army. This was right at the height of Iraq and Afghanistan, both wars. And he went through the Ranger Indoctrination Program, and he joined the 75th Ranger Regiment. And he served there for several years, went through multiple deployments, transitioned into the reserves, and that's where I met him. And so he is really one of the very best of the best, an airborne soldier, a Ranger, and I'm so blessed to be able to serve with him and people like him. And so as we wrap up this first season, be blessed by this interview. And whether you're from a military background or not, Carlos gives so much good stuff here that I'd encourage you to get out a pen and paper or your phone and take some notes there, because there's just a lot of wisdom here. So enjoy it, and we'll see you next year. All right, everybody. Hey, welcome into another episode of the Leading Lounge. Today I got a special guest, someone who's atypical from who I normally sit down and interview, and it is my current company first sergeant for my Army Reserve unit, Carlos Delavilla. Is that how you say it?
Yep, that's right, sir.
There you go. Nailed it. Okay. So Carlos is a fascinating guy. Joined the Army in 2004. Served active duty for a number of years with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and was gracious enough to agree to sit down with me for a few minutes and let me pick his brain. And I don't want to tell too much of your story, Carlos, because it's fascinating, and I'd love for you to tell us yourself. So can we just start with that, about just kind of tell us a little about yourself, your professional journey? I know you've got a civilian job too, but on the Army side, how did you get from 2004 or even before that to where you are today?
Yeah, so I was a young teenager in Teaneck High School, where I went to high school and graduated high school, Teaneck, New Jersey. I was in the delayed entry program, so I joined when I was 17 and would show up on weekends prior to shipping out. My ship date was September of 2004, and I'd go on those weekends and basically learn skills and drills, so I'd be ready for basic training. So then went to the basic training, and I didn't have a contract, so to speak, to go to regiment. I know nowadays that a lot of guys get Ranger contracts, and going to Ranger school will be part of that pipeline that they're guaranteed. I kind of took an unorthodox route. I was open contract, so the basic needs of the Army, wherever at that time, we're the height of Iraq and Afghanistan. So, wherever they could produce infantry soldiers, they would make them either mortarmen or mechanized infantry. So I was open contract, and I found out I was supposed to be going to 4th ID to be a mechanized soldier in the middle of infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. And that's when I decided that I didn't want to be a mechanized soldier. At that time, I knew IEDs were big. That's how the enemy was really hitting us in the war at that time, was IEDs. And my immediate 17-year-old self was like, I don't want to die in a tank. Mm-hmm. So I pleaded with one of the drill sergeants. I was nicknamed in basic. I feel like most soldiers had a nickname that the drill sergeant called them, and mine was ROTC, because I was able to all the drilling and drill ceremony and stuff. I was able to handle the squads during basic, which made less work for the drill sergeant. So I had a drill sergeant who liked me. I wouldn't say he liked me. I mean, he used to smoke me, and back then, a smoking is a smoking. Like you're doing push-ups, so you hit muscle failure, and then they move on to another body part exercise, and so you can't anymore. And he gave me that love. It's like one of those things, tough love.
Right.
But either way, I exploited that at the time. I noticed he had favored me, so I kind of just pleaded with him, like, "Hey, drill sergeant, what do I got to do to go airborne?" Told me score 300 on your PT test, and we'll talk.
And just by the way, sorry to interrupt, Carlos, but for the non-Army audience, a 300 is a perfect score on the PT test.
Yeah, it's changed since then. Now we're at the fitness test, where there's a bunch more exercises, but then it was the push-up, sit-up, and run. And at that age, I had wrestled in high school, so I was pretty fit, and I did well in basic training and infantry school. So it wasn't that difficult for me, but the road was still early for me. But I went to airborne school. My drill sergeant held to his word and got me orders to airborne school. And
Nice.
While we're at airborne school, they had a Ranger instructor, I guess, recruiter, and he showed up in his tan beret. And at that age, especially, I know for me, I was very much influenced by the special operations community and all the wow that came with it, and the fanboy and all that. Like everybody, let's be honest, like everybody, wanted to be a Navy SEAL or special forces. There's all that clout that, we all, I'm not gonna lie and say that there wasn't some of that for me, but it wasn't the driving factor. And to be honest with you, the driving factor was, I want to be trained by the best, and with all the guys next to me, left and right, that are ready to give it all and have made it through, the ringer, so to speak, with physical requirements. So everybody is pretty much on a high level. And it's crazy because I've heard this said that, the job that we did in regiment during those deployments that I went on, it's super high risk, but when you're doing it with people that are ready to give it all, they're all getting the best training, the best equipment, the best opportunities to be prepared for the fight. You kind of give yourself the best fighting chance, Yep. And that's how I looked at it. So for me, that was one of the big driving factors. And I'm also a very competitive person. So when people tell me that I can't do something, I kind of channel that anger I get from it and say, "Oh, you think I won't? I'm gonna do it times 100 just because you said I can't."
Right? Yeah.
Because I had doubters. I had one of the drill sergeants that really didn't like me. He said I would never make it, and so I made sure when I got my tan beret, when I passed, I paid him a visit.
Back and let him know.
I didn't say anything to him. I just made sure I walked by the company area, so he saw, because the Army's funny that way, there's a lot of lessons to be had and to be learned depending on how you take the lemons that they throw at you.
Right.
And I know in my career in the Army, I kind of learned that I've been successful, but it's always been because I try to be as fluid and just go with the flow and put my best effort forward and just, try to be the best that I can be.
Yeah. And most people don't know this, but chaplains serve anywhere in the Army. So you could be, with this really high caliber group, for one assignment, and then your next one you could be in like a non-deployable training unit or something. So I was coming out of the engineers a few years ago and was looking for a new home, and to get put in with PSYOP, I had to go through a series of interviews. I mean, it was multiple interviews with different people to include the group commander. So this was, a couple of group commanders ago. And I go through all these interviews, and this group commander that interviewed me, somewhere along the way, I expressed to him what you just said, which was like, look, if you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to go out of my way to prove to you that you're wrong. And then I'm going to make sure that you see how wrong you were. And he was like, you know what, Chaplain, Come on over. I think you'll do just fine over here.
That's fight. That's determination. That's I feel like leaders need that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, I feel you got to have that fight, that something that drives you, and being around that atmosphere in regiment for me. At the time, I mean, I kind of realized it, obviously, because, I was just a 17, 18-year-old at the time. And you know that you're you're the new fish, right?
Right.
But in retrospect, I look back a lot of the times and I remember just like it was the day before. And I remember a lot of life lessons that I still to this day, I reflect on to help me with dealing with soldiers and situations now as the first sergeant, So it's definitely a time in my life I definitely will cherish.
For sure. So, Carlos, I'm particularly interested in your experience at the Ranger School, which I know is one of the premier training schools for soldiers to go through. You went through it, and you've told me that more than anything, it was a leadership school. Can you explain a little bit about what it was like and what made it a leadership school more than anything else?
Yeah. There's always this argument of, well, what is a real Ranger, right? Because you can go to the Ranger School, which is, in my opinion, in most people's opinions on what it is, it's a leadership school. You get no sleep, you're starving, you're on your feet with a rucksack running around for 20 hours out of a 24-hour day, and you're getting maybe an hour of sleep, and that hour of sleep is broken up. The Ranger instructors are assessing Ranger candidates in leadership roles, and it sucks, right? It's just miserable, right? And it's one of those things where you realize real quick that what gets you through Ranger School is not your physical ability. Like, yes, obviously, people, you're going to hear a lot of people, oh, I broke my ankle, I broke my knee, or I fell. There's tons of, like myself, I had a heat stroke. There's stuff that happens, but when you're there, as long as you're mentally there and you are not going to quit. That's a montage or a moniker that, never quit.
Mm-hmm.
As long as the mind is saying, I'm not going to quit, and you're just going to keep going until you guys kick me out of here, you're going to pass. In Ranger School, it's really, they put you in the worst conditions that you could think of. Like I said, the sleep deprivation, the food deprivation, and then you got all these alpha males thrown together, and there's no rank. You're all roster numbers, and everybody thinks they know the best way to skin the cat.
Mm-hmm.
And you got the whole chiefs, too many chiefs and not enough Indians thing going on too. And so it's an interesting school. But I would say, to sum it all up, because anyone that's there, you're going to have to be physically fit, right? So that's the part that it's like, all right, that's everybody. We expect all you guys to be studs. Like, that's not like, you don't
like
get
a basic for anyone coming in.
Yeah, you're not getting a pat on the back for like, oh, well, at least you're fit, like, no, that's it's expected. You're not doing the 60 percentile. You're expected to do the 80 percentile for PT. So, you're already at a higher standard. So that is not all of it. But what they want is you really find out the people's true self when you take away some sleep from them. Or you take some food away from them. You'll see the biggest, baddest dudes, reduced to little crybabies because, they haven't eaten something in 8 hours, or somebody's sleepy, and then, they could be the brain usually, but you take a few hours of sleep out of there and throw a ruck on his back for 8 hours, and now the guy can't even tell you where we're out on the map.
Yeah.
So you learn a lot about yourself. But you also learn how to read others and work off each other's strengths and weaknesses in order to come together to accomplish a task, and whatever that is. In Ranger School's case, it's a mission. They'll give you a mission, they'll put you in a leadership position, and you're supposed to, execute whatever it is.
Yeah.
In Ranger School, it'll be either a raid or an ambush, and you have your leadership role, and they're going to assess you in that role. And if you're that guy that freezes and doesn't make decisions and doesn't know what to do, then you're probably going to fail.
Right.
But if you make a decision, and it might not be the right decision, you get your guys killed, but you made a decision. And ultimately, that's, I would say, to pull out of Ranger School and not to like take away from what Ranger School is. Like, it's a great school, and there's a lot of stuff in there that you learn, and I'm not making light of it, but from me, I always saw it as, it's a leadership school, and it puts you into worse conditions where you're miserable, and you got to fight through it, for not just for the sake of being the leader, but for your squad, your team, whoever it is you're in charge of. You got to take them into consideration and the mission, and then make a decision. And that's it. There's no hesitation, and that knowing that hesitation could possibly get your buddies killed. That's the part I took away from Ranger School, because I didn't go through Ranger School straight through. I recycled a phase. So when I recycle a phase, you see people fail, and you see what typically gets them to fail, and it's predominantly that hesitation, or the back and forth, or the indecisiveness. But yeah, that's my takeaway from Ranger School. But I wouldn't say that. And you'll probably get maybe some comments or some shade thrown about what I'm going to say about the Rangers. But just having a Ranger tab doesn't make you a Ranger, in my mind. You being part of the Ranger Regiment is what makes you truly a Ranger, because Ranger School is just a school. You're not doing Ranger stuff every day as your 9 to 5, so to speak, in the office. And when you're in regiment, that's what we're doing. We're the apex light infantry unit for the Army. And when the Navy SEALs need help, who do they call? They call the Rangers. When Delta Force has problems, they call the Rangers. When Rangers have problems, they call more Rangers. That's how I grew up learning the Rangers were. And sometimes that esprit de corps really, when you take it in as something that you're a part of, it just makes you a better person. I'd say, like, if we're looking at like outside of the Army, I've been successful, on the civilian side, taking a lot of those life lessons and principles that I learned from being in the regiment and applied them to anything that I kind of, set my sights on. And knock on wood, I've been successed.
So let me ask you this, Carlos. So
Yeah.
you mentioned all these factors like sleep deprivation, the physical demands, kind of the psychological aspect of it, whatever, even just the decision-making part. What would you say was the hardest part about it? Like, all those things considered, the 2 to 3 months, however long the school is, what was the hardest part about it? And what was it the decision-making that was the most helpful in terms of preparing you to be an NCO, to be a first sergeant, even in, like you mentioned, in the civilian context? Would it be that or something else that was the most challenging aspect?
At the time, I would say that it wasn't that I was hesitant in making decisions. I was just so young. I had already a deployment under my belt by the time I went to Ranger School. I had gone to Afghanistan in 2005. And, I got busy. I'll just put it at that. I got my hands dirty in Afghanistan, that first deployment. So I wouldn't say I was a spring chicken when I went to Ranger School, but Ranger School for sure was definitely hard. And I think the hardest thing then at that time wasn't the decision making. It was more of, I was really more worried about being peered, because they have a peer system in Ranger School. And like we had spoke earlier, in Ranger School, you don't have rank. You go there and you have your name and U.S. Army, and that's it on your uniform. And everybody is just a roster number on their helmet, and you're a Ranger candidate, so and so.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to work together as a squad. And at the end of each phase, you get to peer, and you basically are voting for the guys in your squad that aren't pulling their weight. They're not, they might be making the cut, but they're not pulling the weight with the rest of the team or the squad, depending on what phase you're in. In Derby, you're at the team level, and at mountain phase, you're at squad, and Florida phase, you're at the platoon level. But ultimately, every phase, you're getting a peer. And I was more worried about getting peered, just because I knew at that age, I was young, I was cocky. Most people that are going to Ranger school that are outside of regiment are usually NCOs already or officers already. I was a PFC when I went, so I was very young in the Army, but I was experienced because I had a deployment under my belt. I already had my expert infantryman's badge. So I wouldn't say I was ready, but regiment, when they send us there, they send us there prepared. So my leadership made sure that I was, the Ranger handbook was memorized, the battle drills were all there, and I was set up for success. That's for sure. But that was my biggest worry then. In retrospect, I think the hardest part was keeping your emotions in check. I think and I'd say that's something I struggle with now. I wouldn't say daily, but that I feel like everybody has that, where their immediate emotional reaction is to go off on someone, but they got to bite their tongue and restrain themselves a little bit.
Yeah.
Exercise some restraint. Yeah, so I definitely think that was the hardest part. I almost got kicked out of Ranger school for having emotional reactions. But so I'd say that was a hard thing. The sleep was also pretty tough. I learned,
sure.
you learn. There's two types of Rangers we always used to joke about. There's the sleepy Ranger, and then there's the hungry Ranger. And I was okay with not eating. I was a wrestler in high school, so I was used to cutting weight, and I was okay with no food. But man, the sleep, there's a reason why they say it's comparable to drinking. When you stay up so many hours and try to drive, we call it zoning. We used to call it zoning. When you're just, it's almost like you're hallucinating. When you're up for so many hours, and the food deprivation, you're not getting enough calories, and all the physical exertion that you're expected to do all day, and then you're getting an hour of sleep broken up. It definitely wears on you. But sleep would probably be that was probably the hardest thing.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's the same answer I've got from everyone I've asked that, like to a man. Everyone I've asked that question to that's been through Ranger school, they've always said, yeah, it's the sleep deprivation, that all these other factors are difficult, but then when you combine them with lack of sleep, it just, you really find out kind of what you're made of, and if you got what it takes or not. So
if you want it bad enough.
Yeah. So one of my favorite things about the Army, and in particular being with the PSYOP group that we're in now, is I tell people I think I've served with and have gotten to know some of the best leaders in the world. The caliber of soldier and leader is pretty amazing to me, and it's one of my favorite things about what I get to do. So in your case, you've got more experience than I've got, and you've got, like you said, you're with regiment. So undoubtedly you served with some incredible leaders. So who would you say is the best leader you've ever served with? And when you think about them being the best you've ever served with, what is it about them that made them great? Was it one thing in particular or a few different attributes? What would you say?
So that one, the first person that comes to mind is, at the time, he was my first team leader in regiment. After passing the Ranger Indoctrination Program, I processed into Hunter Army Airfield at 1st Battalion in Savannah, Georgia. And I found out I was going to 1st Platoon, 1st Squad, Alpha Team. And my team leader was Sergeant Mike Hill. And that guy, man, I wouldn't say there was anything in particular specifically that I could pinpoint that he did that make me say that he's the best leader. Because at the time I wouldn't say he's my enemy, but man, he made my life, the first year and a half I was in regiment, a very difficult time for me. But we say in regiment, so like I said, there's sayings for everything, right? For Ranger school, like I was saying, the sleepy Ranger versus the hungry Ranger. In regiment, you're either a smart Ranger or you're a strong Ranger. If you're a smart ranger, you get, you answer the right way, you're not going to get smoked. If you're not smart, you're going to be strong because you're going to learn by the numbers. And I was unfortunately a strong ranger. So he really worked me that first year and made me really want to be there. And I'd say he's the best leader because he was a leader, not a boss, where they say, lead by example, lead from the front, he embodied that. He had high expectations of me and my ATL, my assistant team leader, but he was never the one saying that we were in the wrong from the back. He was always in the front, either finished, got to the drop zone or to the assembly area before us. He shot expert, did higher on the PT test. Like, he embodied lead from the front and lead by example. And, there's a lot of other things that I could go on about that I learned from him. But those two things, I would say, makes him the best leader right away, just because it's something I try to incorporate into my leadership style. That, I would never ask a soldier to do something that I haven't already done and done well. Just that whole adage, the being a boss versus a leader. A boss will be that armchair quarterback telling someone to do something that they've never done themselves. A leader is going to roll their sleeves up and say, let's go, let's do it together. Whether it's something they've done before or it's something they haven't, they'll tackle that with their team together. And he was someone to me, especially at that time, where I was so readily to be influenced by, and he was someone who just, he now when I talk about it, I sometimes am like, man, he was like my hero. He kind of was. He emulated what I knew. I was like, wow, that's the kind of ranger I want to be. He would always get to the assembly area before us on jumps, and we could never, we would try. We would even pull slips as hard as we could to get close to the assembly area, and he always beat us. And it was always something that I was like, we all respected him for it. So Sergeant Hill, he for sure. And I've been around a lot of great leadership. I would say he's the best just because I feel like he influenced me the most.
Yeah. I was telling somebody the story of, have you seen a statue at Fort Benning? I think it's right in front of the infantry school that's just called Follow Me or something like that.
Yeah. That's, yeah.
Yeah, so I was telling somebody.
It's where the infantry museum is now.
Yeah, that's right. I was telling somebody, so I've got all this education under my belt, right? I got a PhD in organizational leadership. I've probably written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers. I mean, not of papers, but of pages on leadership and what does it mean, and both for the Army, going through all their schools and civilian schools, and giving sermons and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, you know what? The best definition I've ever heard is just that statue and just two words: follow me. Like the guy's just out leading from the front, like you're saying. He's not out behind, and it's not like it's not this crazy recipe of you got to be, brilliant and strong and brave, and you just got to be willing to go first and lead other people to what you're going to ask them to do. And
you're going to fail, and the people that and you learn a lot from those failures, and some people go a lot longer without having that failure, right, where they get knocked off their horse. Like for me, I had a couple gut checks, but I would say, for me, Jump Master was my biggest gut check. I eventually overcame.
Well, it's interesting. The more leaders that I interview and I talk through this podcast and other things, is that like being willing to fail and even having the expectation of failure is like a prerequisite. It's like you don't lead because there's a guarantee of success. You lead because it's the right thing to do, and you're there, and it's just sort of something that you step up to the plate for. So next question I want to ask you, and this is one of my favorite questions to ask people. So one of the focuses of the podcast is not just on leading, but in particular on communicating. And anyone who's been put in a position of leadership, you got to communicate. Like, for example, when I see you once a month or however often it is, you're standing at least twice a day in front of this formation of a couple hundred soldiers, and you've got to communicate with these soldiers. You're communicating with section leaders and everything else. So undoubtedly, when you lead and you communicate, you fail at some point, probably at a lot of points at communicating. So can you just tell me about one time in particular when you failed at communicating? And from that experience, what'd you learn from it? And did it change how you approached communication after that at all?
Oh man, yeah, I did it. So this is actually a really good topic because I feel like it's almost like they come hand in hand with leadership, right? You got to be able to communicate, whether there's so many different mediums and conduits to communicate, right? You got verbal, especially nowadays. You got emails, you got text messages, you got verbal, you have video. There's so many ways to communicate, and from coming from regiment and active duty and going to reserves, active duty side, you're in every day. You're seeing the guys you work with 24/7, all the time, and there's high expectations in special operations. So there's little micromanaging. A lot of stuff's implied, right? So when you go from that and then go to the reserves and civilian world, you're expecting that all the high esteem and how meticulous you are about preparing for something, to do something that you are compared to others. You're kind of blown away. Like, why are you putting as much effort into this as I am? Like, this is like me. I'm taking it like this is the end all mission. I got to make sure, I got all the grenades and I'm everything. I'm ready to go. And, in the civilian world and in the reserves, you realize like a lot of the stuff that you would think are implied, they're not for others.
Mm-hmm.
So in the communication part of it, when I transitioned from reserves to active duty regiment to reserves, I communicated some training that needed to be done. I think it was for our CLS course that we were having, and it was probably the first year I was back into the reserves, because I got out in 2009 from active duty, and then I didn't come back I was in IR for about 3 years and didn't come back to the reserves until 2012. Okay. And that year I came back. That's kind of where I learned the whole reserve world and all the lingo that comes with it and how the processes are. And I communicated that to a soldier and thought that they had it. I made an assumption because the soldier from the 82nd, he was active duty at one time. So I figured like, oh, he's got it. And when it came time for the training, everything was basically nothing ever got done that needed to be done. And after that, I kind of realized that with communicating that, hey, I'm in a different world now. I got to start looking at it from other people's perception, because everyone's not coming from the environment I'm used to. So right. I got to think about it from other people's perspective. And if I want to succeed, I also I have to learn how to not tie my ego to trying to communicate effectively to others to accomplish a mission. Because to me, as long as you're mission focused, it's like you got to be able to communicate. And I've learned now I'm a little bit more long-winded than I used to be. I used to be more brief, but everybody has different learning curves and different ways they hear and take information. So I try to take communication now from the whole the shotgun blast approach, where I try to give as much information as possible. That way they can take that information and make it work for them. As long as I give them a goal that I want them to accomplish, and I give them all the information, it's kind of like however you want to cut it, you cut it. But I gave you the goal, and I gave all the information that I can so you can accomplish the task. So I've learned nowadays that I take that approach more, as opposed to when I was probably in E5 or E6, where I'd be working with somebody that's been working with me for a little bit, and I don't have to spell out things for them. Yeah. And you usually learn that when you're transitioning into a new group, a new team, or a new detachment full of soldiers. There's that learning curve, but eventually you get that familiarity where you don't have to, with some soldiers, you don't have to communicate everything micromanage. You just, hey, McLeet, you got that taken care of? Yeah, no problem. And I don't have to get into the weeds,
Right.
because I let them handle it, and that's another part of leadership, to help empower. You got to know when to not micromanage too much.
Yeah, for sure.
I know when I was a young leader and I got micromanaged, I hated it.
Yeah.
I'd say that was the biggest. It wasn't the end of the world, but it definitely woke me up to seeing other perspectives and taking the shotgun approach, I'd say, to communication.
Yeah. No, one of my favorite tools that I picked up from the military is the idea of a back brief. And I do this with my kids all the time. Last night, I'm having this conversation with my oldest daughter, and I'm just like you were talking about. I give the shotgun approach. I'm just giving everything, just to make somewhere along the way, you'll pick up the thing that I'm really wanting you to hear. And, it was like eyes glazed over, and I didn't know if she was getting it. I was like, okay, tell me in your own words what you just heard me say. And so I found, I fail pretty often at communicating, and just the whole concept of the back brief. Now, obviously, you can't do that in big groups, but I found that to be really helpful. Is just like, okay, I just want to make sure you got it. Tell me.
No, that was always even when I was a private, my team leader did that to us too, because it's also a tool, I feel like, to figure out your soldiers. Like you said, it's not a big group, but like more like a team or a squad level. Talking to your junior enlisted, and like making sure that they comprehend,
Yep.
to make sure that they receive the message like fully and are going to move out after. And sometimes you just like, hey, Johnson, what did I just tell you? You said to do this and do that. No, that's not what I said. What? And it's also another way to learn, like, all right, Johnson, I got to basically spell things out for him,
right?
Versus, because everybody, and that's where you learn the longer you're in the Army, you come across a lot of different people and different walks of life, especially in the reserves. And sometimes some people, I joke sometimes, because some people I'll call them idiot savants, where we had a guy in my first reserve unit, Reardon. This guy, definitely idiot savant to a T. He's a Marine Corps rigger, came into the reserves to go PSYOP, and was a jump master. And sometimes you had to spell things out for that guy, but he'd bust out tensile strengths and certain nylon cords for the parachute system, the T10, T11, and he knew how to sew. And that's why I called him idiot savant, because some things, the basic common sense stuff, like, Jesus, Reardon, get this right. But then you'd ask him what the tensile strength is of type 2 nylon, and he's like, oh, it's 570 pounds, and it depending on how many stitches you put in, if you put double stitch, and I'm like, Jesus, man, like, but you come across a lot of those types of soldiers, and you learn communication is really, key. And like you said, that back brief is a freaking awesome tool to make sure it's like, hey, you received message, how copy?
Yep.
Yep. Tell me what you heard, and you don't hear it right, and you're like, oh man, okay, let me redo this again, so you understand what I'm trying to tell you, because sometimes you don't get it right the first time, and I've definitely for sure have had soldiers in situations where my first attempt at communicating something, it didn't get across.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think everybody who's led in any capacity has had that experience for sure. So, well, you kind of alluded, my next question, you alluded to earlier, you kind of gave, when you're talking about Ranger School, the difference in what was difficult then versus like in hindsight, in retrospect. Now I would say this, but my question is, and this is another one of my favorite questions to ask people, if the present Sergeant Delavilla could visit with the younger, maybe PFC Delavilla, what advice about leadership, given, the years of experience you've got now, what's some advice you would give yourself?
I'm glad I learned the lesson early versus later. But either way, I'd still tell young PFC Delavilla that when I finally do get become an NCO, that the way that I wouldn't say raised, but how I was mentored in the Army isn't the only way to mentor everyone. And that I've learned, I feel like that is when I had my breakthrough as a leader, because I feel like I had all the qualities when I was in regiment, but I feel like I didn't actually become a real leader until I had that, come to Jesus wake up moment where it's like, wow, you really got to be open and able to, I don't know, I would say it's more of like reading people and figuring out the best way to get what you want out of that person without shutting them down. Because some approaches I've learned, you can take the bull in a china shop approach, right? And it doesn't work for everybody. Some people, you'll actually get them to regress. I actually have a buddy. He's from second bat, so Ranger bat. We call those guys anger bat, or not anger bat. I'm sorry, that's money bat. Money bat's the bank robbers, and then anger bat's third bat because they're close to the flagpole. But he used the way he was raised in regiment, and you get smoked, and he did that with a soldier in reserves, and the soldier actually killed himself. That's the worst way to learn that doesn't work. Luckily, I learned before something like that ever happened to me. But what I learned was the way I was brought up was, maybe it worked for me, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone. And having that open mind, because I've noticed from a couple of courses that I've gone to the Army, MRT, one of them, that it really helps with self-reflection and really reflecting. And I feel like being a good leader, you kind of have to be able to reflect and look at yourself and see where your faults are. If you have biases, being closed-minded, I feel like I'm not closed-minded anymore, but I feel like at a younger age, when I was a young E5, I was, and I probably made a lot of things harder for myself than it needed to be because I was so closed-minded and wanted it to be the way I knew it to be as right. And now I've noticed, going into things with an open mindset, it's always an opportunity to learn. And you could always learn something from all walks of life. So that would be something I'd say is like, hey, be a little bit more open to hearing different perspectives and just anything, and then not just be so quick to shut it out.
Yeah.
I'd say that's the big one.
Yeah, no, that's huge. My wife and I talk about that all the time with our kids is, I'm wired a certain way, probably similar to you, but my kids just are wired different. And it's the same whether you're leading soldiers or, employees or team members or whatever the context is, you got to kind of have some relational intelligence and just go, all right, now what does John need? What does Joe need? What does Sally need? Because you gave that powerful example of if I approach this person like I was approached, it might actually be the absolute worst thing for them right now. And so, just kind of pumping the brakes a little bit, slowing down and can be it might be a long-term win. It feel like a short-term loss, but it's the best thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And in regiment, you want the guy, everyone that's there, they want to be there. Right. So you can take that approach and you'll probably be more successful because everybody that's there wants to be there. But, in the reserves and all other things in life is not all just related to life and death. But you do learn that having that relational intelligence and being able to read people, you'll figure out like, yep, that's probably not the best approach to take.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Before I sign off with you, Carlos, I was just going to tell you, I wanted to just kind of affirm your leadership, man. I have really enjoyed serving with you, and I wanted to approach you and ask you about doing the podcast just because I think so highly of you and getting to see you in action and the way soldiers respect you and interact with you. And so, I appreciate your time, man. Be willing to sit down and share a little bit of wisdom with me. And, just I wish you all the best for whatever happens after you and I part ways in the Army. But But yeah, I think very highly of you and grateful to know you, man.
Yeah, well, thanks, sir. I appreciate you having me on. I like hearing what you're doing, and I will definitely be subscribing. I feel like I know I approach not just life, but leadership, and especially in the Army, to keep an open mind and always think that you could always learn something. I learn something every day. You know, it may be something trivial and small, but at some days, but I try to learn something every day, and I definitely can learn from other leaders. So I definitely respect what you're doing, and yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Leading Lounge, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us today. The Leading Lounge is brought to you by Communicate to Care, where we are building better leaders by building better people. For more information, visit us online at www.communicatecare.com. This is your host, Dr. Justin Dubose, and we'll see you next time, right here in the Leading Lounge.